You have spent years drilling vocabulary and acing your written exams, but the moment you actually travel abroad and try to order a simple coffee, your mind shuts down. This gap between linguistic competence, knowing the structural rules, and communicative competence, the ability to use them, is a nearly universal experience for language learners. This response is the predictable outcome of the global standard for language instruction, the Grammar Translation Method, or GTM. GTM approaches language as a purely analytical exercise. In classrooms from Beijing to Tripoli, students spend their time memorizing explicit grammar tables and translating sentences into their native tongue. Curious, this raises a difficult question. If a language is a system of rules, why does mastering those exact rules often make it harder to actually use the language in real time? The reality is that traditional education isn't teaching us how to communicate. It is training the brain in a specific academic cognitive skill that has very little to do with the mechanics of speech. To find the source of this problem, we look at the 18th and 19th centuries, when the grammar translation method was first standardized with a very different goal than modern fluency. GTM was originally designed to decode dead classical languages, allowing students to read ancient Latin and Greek literature, not to hold a marketplace conversation. Early proponents of this method argued that the process of rigorous structural analysis built mental discipline. They prioritized the intellectual labor of deconstructing a sentence over the practical need to speak one. The absurdity of this focus is visible in 19th century textbooks, where students were tasked with translating nonsensical sentences like, "The philosopher pulled the lower jaw of the hen." Spontaneous creative output was entirely excluded from this curriculum. The only skill exercised was reading, and even then, only within the narrow context of translation. Modern schools are essentially copy-pasting an ancient reading tool onto living spoken languages, and it is crippling their students. Modern research shows us exactly what happens when you apply this archaic framework to today's students. Researchers in Libya recently conducted an empirical study to measure how the grammar translation method affected students' communicative competence after years of study. This chart shows the results. Through rote memorization, students demonstrated strong grammatical accuracy, with a mean score of 3.84 out of 5, but their actual conversation skills were anemic. Fluency dropped to 2.31, and their ability to interact with others fell to 2.18. The first reason for this failure is the processing lag. GTM forces the brain to take a massive detour. Instead of moving from a concept directly to the target language, the student translates the thought into their native language, mentally scans for the correct grammar rule, and then produces the result. In a real-time conversation, that computational delay is fatal. Then there is the anxiety factor. Because GTM demands 100% accuracy on written tests, students become conditioned to fear any verbal slip-up. The 19th century student Balsan described this perfectly. He said the attempt to speak left him overcome by a veritable forest of paragraphs and an impenetrable thicket of grammatical rules. When you over-prioritize strict rules, you build a psychological barrier. The fear of making a mistake becomes so high that students stop trying to interact. If the results are this poor, why does the grammar translation method remain the dominant teaching style across the globe? In places like China and Libya, GTM is an institutional adaptation to the realities of mass education. It is an incredibly efficient system for administrators. It is cheap to implement, easy for teachers to manage, and perfect for standardized exams. Our global education system has optimized for classroom management and measurable test scores, while sacrificing the ability for students to actually speak to one another. This does not mean grammar is useless. According to the theory of structuralism, grammar is the essential foundation students need to understand how a language is built. But to achieve fluency, learners must move toward communicative approaches that prioritize meaning and immersion over rigid form. Real fluency requires learners to treat language as a social instrument, where communicative intent takes precedence over structural perfection. If you want to actually speak, you have to leave the search for a perfect score behind, step out of the textbook, and be willing to break the very rules you spent years memorizing.